Well, hey there, and welcome to week 5 of the Emotionally Healthy Woman podcast. I am your co-host, Kathy Bruce, and this podcast features a series of my conversations with author Geri Scazzero based upon her book, The Emotionally Healthy Woman. And if you were here with us last week, you'll know that we talked about quit denying anger, sadness, and fear. And this week, we are discussing the principle of quit blaming. So now I would love to introduce to you Geri Scazzero. Welcome, Geri, to the podcast.
Good morning, Kathy. Great to be here.
Awesome. Well, it is, no, it's not Tuesday. It is Friday. Often we record these on a Tuesday. So I had written down Tuesday, but this is Friday, March 5th. And we are hopefully heading into the tail end of winter. I don't know about you, but I'm ready to get outside.
I noticed the mornings are lighter earlier and of course lighter later. And that's such a wonderful feeling.
I love it too. Well, we are in a wonderful chapter today in the Emotionally Healthy Woman book, and it's one of my favorites. And the title of this chapter is called Quit Blaming. And if you've been tracking with our podcast thus far, you know that the book used to be called Quit, I Quit, right?
Yes.
And so this is another quit that we're going to look at, the idea of quit blaming. And so we're going to just launch right in. One of my favorite things that you wrote about in this chapter, Geri, is how much we see this blaming behavior in the Bible. And when I think of blaming, I always think of the classic one of, you hear about, well, Adam blamed Eve, for eating the fruit. But, you also wrote Eve blamed the serpent. Sarah blamed Hagar. Joseph's brothers blamed him. The Israelites blamed Moses. Moses blamed God. And it goes on and on. We see these examples of blaming even in the Bible. And so clearly this unhealthy, behaviors has run rampant throughout our lineage. But I'd love to know your thoughts on why that is. Why do you think people play the blame game?
Well, I've come, I think, full circle because I have a much more compassionate stance towards the response of blaming. Blaming is a defense mechanism to protect your sense of self, to protect your okayness. And so foundationally, we all want to feel like we are good and maybe even more importantly, lovable. When something threatens that, our lovability or our goodness, our default, and it's a learned default. Blaming is a learned behavior. Our default behavior is to protect what we have built up as in the story we tell ourselves as to what makes us good, what makes us okay, what makes us lovable. And so I will blame you rather than me thinking or feeling I am bad. And so it can be out of circumstances where I don't think I can fail, or I don't think I can make mistakes, or I must be right, or I must be in control. All these kinds of messages that we received growing up that really created a false sense of self, a false sense of okayness. And so now we've got to sort of defend that. And one of the major ways we defend our sense of okayness is I won't feel bad. I won't feel unlovable. And I will make you bad. I will blame you rather than allow a sense of myself to feel like a bad person, so to speak. And the messages are really endless that we've received growing up. And so it's a matter of really paying attention to anything that threatens our sense of okayness.
Yeah. Yeah. And we've talked quite a bit in some of the previous podcast about how our family of origin certainly plays into this, as you mentioned. And you mentioned control, like a sense of control. And this, I know, something you talk about in the book as well, that this this blaming someone else gives us a sense of control. Um, is it almost like also it's just, do people do it also sort of just to abdicate responsibility as well?
Um, hmm, absolutely. I'm just trying, I'm thinking about it. It's a kind of it's a two-edged sword because you are really you're giving away your freedom, you're giving away your responsibility. Blaming feels powerful
Mm,
because there's an energy in it. And what can and it, what it is, it's warding off. Again, it's warding off your sense of um doom or whatever around how you feel about yourself,
right.
I'm
So
not
that I have
control
control. I
right.
have control. So I'm in power because
Yes.
I'm blaming the other person. I'm shouldering the responsibility on you for whatever
Correct.
the situation
Yeah.
is.
Or I'm in control, or I am successful. I am not a failure. I I do know everything. I mean, it's amazing the littlest things that can trigger our sense of okayness. I mean, losing a card game, a simple card game, uh, or not being right over the silliest things where you and someone else might be having a conversation, but something gets triggered, and it's deep. I All I can say is that I think it's so pervasive in our culture because it's deep. It's
Mhm.
very deep in us because, again, it's touching on the core of who we think we ought to be.
Right.
But what's so sad is we don't have to earn our goodness. We don't have to earn our lovability. It's inherent. We don't have to prove it. We already are lovable. But again, the messages that we received growing up are kind of contrary to that. Most of us got approval, not necessarily maybe unconditional love. And the approval
Mm,
was based on condition. And I will say this, it is a very much learned behavior. I like to say I grew up in a family of blamers, and I became a blamer, and I gave birth to four blamerlings. Yes,
wow.
and it scares the heck out of me when I would scare the heck out of me when I would see this behavior in them, and I could totally trace it back to, myself and Pete, and yeah, they learn it. And I will say this, I think one of the most mature things a human being can ever do, and that's a big statement. One of the most mature things a human being can ever do is when they cross over the line from blaming others to taking responsibility for their
Yeah.
own life.
Yes.
That's a huge, and I think we even see it in scripture. I think we begin to see underdeveloped human beings, whether it's Sarah or Abraham or Peter and the disciples who are constantly bickering and blaming. You actually begin to see them cross a line in their transformation when they are, and one of those symptoms is they're not blaming anymore.
Right.
It's a really beautiful thing. It's a huge developmental task.
Yeah. And as I was just thinking too, as you mentioned, your own family line of blamers, as for the parents that are listening out there, I think one of the most wonderful things we can do is model not blaming, or to our kids, or also if we have messed up and blamed, that we take responsibility for that. And
Yes. And I know how deep this is in me because it's still a challenge for me not to blame,
yeah.
especially those closest to me over the silliest things. It's such a default, but
Mm,
it is really beautiful experience when you begin to grow in it, um, and cross that line, even to begin to have eyes to see what blaming is really all about. It's a defense mechanism.
yeah.
uh,
So that self-awareness piece is really critical.
Huge and courageous. I mean, it is courageous to take responsibility for yourself instead of blaming. But also have to say, it is just one of the most liberating things
Mm,
to not, when I quit blaming, when I became aware of, what that was all about, how I was protecting myself by blaming others, and was able to let that guard down and take responsibility for myself. I mean, it was freedom. Like, wow, I have choices. Uh, I have lots of choices. And so I don't have to go into a default mode of blaming. I have to stop and pause and say, okay, what is this about? How do I want to respond? And how do I want to take responsibility in this situation? Because blaming is giving away your freedom. Blaming is
Mm.
giving away your power
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
along with responsibility.
Yeah. And what I love in this chapter is you go right into this thing you created called the Personal Freedom Toolkit.
Yeah.
I was like, yes, I want the Personal Freedom Toolkit. I need as many tools as I possibly can get. And we don't have time to go over all of them. You'll have to, our listeners will have to get the book to
Right.
read through all of them. But I thought we would just pick a few, starting with the fence of separateness. Can you tell us our listeners what that is?
Sure. And I also just mentioned that the beautiful thing about this toolkit is it's not something you're reaching for outside of yourself. These things exist within us,
Mm,
and they're at our disposal. We're just not aware of them.
yeah.
So the first thing is what's called the fence of separateness, but that's boundaries. We might call it boundaries. And the reason I love the image of a fence is I could identify that. Growing up in a town where people had fences to identify our different boundaries between our yards was really helpful because it was an important boundary. I wouldn't throw garbage over in my neighbor's yard, and they wouldn't throw their garbage in mine. There's a fence. Like you keep yours. It was very clear to see what they were responsible for in their yard and what was I was responsible for in my yard. And in the same way, God has given us built intrinsic boundaries. And I mentioned the three in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Our thoughts are a boundary, our
Mm-hmm.
feelings are a boundary, and our skin is a boundary.
Yes, I wrote those in big letters the first time I ever went through this study. That is, can you say that again? What are those three?
Yeah, those three boundaries. And I believe this comes from Cloud and Townsend. Henry Cloud and John Townsend have really the best work, I think, on
Mm-hmm.
boundaries. But they identify them as your thoughts, your skin, and your feelings. So, for example, thoughts are really important, and people cross our thoughts, and we cross their thoughts all the time. Is it like just like my neighborhood might violate the fence and just come in my yard, without asking? And I do that when I say to somebody, "Oh, how could you think that?
Mm,
That's a ridiculous idea." I've just crossed someone's thought boundaries.
mm,
People can cross mine, and I just have to be aware of that. Or if we say around feelings, we say things like, "Oh, you shouldn't feel that way." Well, I have just crossed someone's feeling boundary. And skin.
yeah,
Huge.
yeah,
I mean, they're all a violation of a
yeah.
person's intrinsic dignity, all of them. But I don't care if you are 1 or 91, whether you are single or you are married, your skin is a boundary to your dignity. And
Mm,
at any given moment, if you feel like someone's crossing your skin in inappropriate ways or without your permission or in inappropriate, then you have the right and the responsibility to say something.
yeah. And it's so interesting. I mean, I think many of our listeners can probably relate to just even current culture of this issue, that we see in the news. I mean, I'm thinking of one individual in particular that's been in the news a lot the last couple of weeks who, you know, crossed some skin boundaries with women,
Right.
and they're now coming forward, and it's yeah, it's such a big one and such a rampant.
It is. And, obviously a 1-year-old can't speak for themselves, but boy, would I love to teach this to 10, 12, 15-year olds
Mm,
and give that, every young woman, young man needs this toolkit for their they don't need permission to have boundaries. It's inherent, but
Yeah.
they do need to be taught that these are things that they can use and utilize.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we could talk for hours on that subject, but we're gonna move on to the oxygen mask of self-care. And this is one of my favorites because the last year I've really been working hard at this in my own life. And when COVID first hit, I likened it to, I realized very quickly when we started going into isolation and quarantine, the image of the oxygen mask in the plane, and I was caring for all these people that were living at my house and my son and my husband, and I realized if I didn't put on my own oxygen mask first and take care of myself, that I was going to burn out and I was going to be of no use or good to anyone. So can you talk a little about just how you
Yeah,
this
sure.
oxygen mask?
Yeah, I mean, huge. And the reason oxygen mask is synonymous with self-care, and the reason this is so huge is because of, again, messages that we've internalized around probably two things in particular: our value and self-worth around productivity, maybe,
Mm,
and around rest. So let me
yes.
ask you this. Let me ask you,
All right, put me on the spot.
yeah, like what? So, what are messages you got around productivity or approval for, whatever? And what was the message you got about rest?
Yeah. Oh, 100%. My early childhood messages and even into my adulthood were, if you work hard, you can do anything, you can accomplish anything. And so this idea of being driven and working for outcomes was what it was in my DNA from my family of
And
origin.
how is that tied into your sense of goodness?
Yeah, well, it was tied into my sense of self significance and my value. So I wasn't of value or I wasn't approved unless I achieved and accomplished certain things.
Wow. Yeah. And then what about the message around rest and
I don't think I
rest?
saw that much. I'm, it's interesting you're asking this specific question because I don't think I've really dug into that very much in terms of, thinking about, it seemed like we were always on the go. My dad was always out of town on business, and my mom went back to work when my brother and I were in middle school, and so we were always on the go.
Wow.
So I don't remember a whole lot of rest. I remember family vacations. Those were like a big, but even those were highly planned, highly
Exhausting.
organized,
Hmm.
had an agenda.
Hmm. Interesting. It sounds like my kind of vacation. Not my husband's, but
No, I mean everyone vacations differently,
right,
but
exactly,
but
exactly.
yeah, but now I'm like my Sabbath is nobody touches my Sabbath.
Right.
That's
So,
been
so the oxygen mask of self-care is critical. Again, it's critical to examine the messages that we internalized, and we have to transform them because in order to be a loving human being, you must you must live into your humanity, your human beingness. And we're not human doings, we're human beings. And we are not energizer bunnies. We need rest. And we
mm,
actually don't even, it's not that we rest to work. I mean, rest helps our work, but rest is a way of acknowledging God's love for us.
mm,
God didn't create us to be, I mean, that's slavery. The
yeah.
Egyptian slavery or even slavery in America, it was nonstop work. That is slavery. And I feel like we're not living out who God intended us to be. We're actually living in bondage when we can't stop. And so the oxygen of self care is to value our dignity made in the image of God, even God rested,
Hmm.
and to delight, et cetera, et cetera. And but also secondarily is when we do rest, when we do take in the oxygen of what we need for self-care and thriving, boy, oh boy, we're more loving people.
Absolutely. Well, and we're healthier.
Healthier
We
physically,
exhibit
mentally.
health. We exhibit, I find I exhibit more of the fruit of the spirit that when I am rested
Yes.
in my relationships than if I'm not.
Exactly. And again, we're talking to lots of leaders here, and leaders in particular. It can be, productivity can be a drug, right? It can be an addiction, but it's really important. It's such a faith step to get off the treadmill of nonstop activity and to rest, play, work according to who God made you, and you will see your fruit increase
Mm.
versus killing yourself and not having a lot of fruit, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, we're gonna jump to a third one. And again, for our listeners, there are way more than we're hitting on today in the book. So the Personal Freedom Toolkit is in this chapter. It's phenomenal. This last one we're going to touch on today is the mirror of self-confrontation.
Yes.
So what is that, Geri? Sounds scary.
It is so well. Okay, listen to me, right? It was scary. It was scary for me because I had so many defenses because my script growing up was, kind of be perfect. So I mean, it was so unconscious, but therefore you don't want to be wrong. You don't want to make mistakes. And to think that I have to look at myself and admit mistakes and admit, imperfection, admit when I'm wrong, it was like death. It was death. But it's a good death. And self-confrontation really goes hand in hand with this quit blaming, because you have to look at yourself, and it gives you the ability to look at yourself and take responsibility. Again, such a beautiful image in what scripture talks about is death and resurrection. Self-confrontation is death, but it leads to resurrection. Non-self-confrontation is bondage. It's bondage. And it's lack of, and it doesn't lead to freedom. It just leads to increasing your defenses. So that's the place where, Jeremiah was right when he says the heart is deceitfully wicked. And it is. It's not all wicked, but I can certainly have the worst motives going on in my heart. And I need to be looking and examining my heart regularly and my motives. And again, I think it is a place of freedom, but it takes courage.
Yeah. And time, I would think as well, to continually be on a journey of self-confrontation.
Yeah, I think it's probably one of the most important Christian disciplines in practice there might be. And because it's saying, hey, I am growing up emotionally and spiritually. And when I am going to look at the log in my own eye before I take the speck out of somebody else's, and admit things where I need to admit them. I mean, it's just a huge, for me, it was a huge developmental task.
Yeah.
And I didn't die. I didn't die.
You didn't. You're here to tell the story.
I'm here to tell the story.
Well, one question that I had as it relates to not just these three, but the others you highlight in the book and the toolkit. And this is when I've done this study with groups from our church. There's one question that tends to come up, and it's the question of, how do you handle other people's reactions when you start applying these tools? And I can give you an example out of my own life. I worked at a church a few years back where when I interviewed, I told them, I said, I need my Saturdays off for my son, for my husband, for myself.
Right.
My Saturdays off. Oh, yes. No problem. That, yes, we don't work on Saturdays. And then I got into the job, and within a month, I was being called on to work on Saturdays. And it was always something really important, like a baptism or and so I know this is rampant in the church, and oftentimes, because many are living this, these false selves and these lies about, not having rest, not having boundaries. How do you, so like if my boss said, no, you have to be there, how do you suggest that our listeners handle when they start putting up those boundaries and they get a negative reaction?
Can I ask how you responded you had clarified that expectation before you got hired.
I did, and I don't want to answer how I responded.
Okay. Okay. Well,
Because I went along. I went
yeah.
along and I violated my own value. I mean, I'm vulnerable enough to admit it, but
But let me ask you, no, that's sure, of course, of
yeah.
course. You were still developing, And so how would you respond today if you were in that situation?
I think, well, first I would point back to, there was a clear expectation, when I was hired, and it was agreed upon. And I would refer back to that, and then I just would say, I'm sorry, but I cannot be there on Saturday. It's just,
Mhm.
I need to respect that boundary for the sake of my family, for the sake of my own health. And suffice to say, I didn't stay at that church very long
Yeah, yeah.
because it was
And
constantly being
and
pushed.
so sometimes, Kathy, it is a matter of just expressing the boundary again. When somebody pushes back, it's going to happen. Especially when I mean, again, there's all sorts of situations that'll be so fun to role play here.
Mm,
It can be in a situation where you have a long-standing relationship with someone, and now all of a sudden you've changed the boundaries. Like, for example, when Pete and I started doing Sabbaths, oh my goodness, we had to disappoint so many people. We had to change expectations with family, friends,
mm,
staff, because all of a sudden we're saying, well, we're not going to hang out tonight. And not that there weren't times for social, but we doing Sabbath meant other things in our life had to change.
right.
And so, one, you can be disappointing people. That's a developmental task, learning to disappoint people.
Right.
It doesn't make you bad. It may make them sad, but doesn't make you bad. But so those are long-standing relationships. It can be in the case of employment. Well, what happens if my job is on the line if I don't do what they ask me to do?
Right.
And then here's the beautiful thing. You don't have to blame them. You're still in a place of individual power because you have choices. You can say, okay, well, I really love this job. I want to stay here, but I got to negotiate here. I'll negotiate. I'm willing to negotiate.
Mm,
Or it may be, you know what, my, no, I actually, this is a really a big deal of integrity for me. And this is going to be a loss, but actually I'm going to have to move to another job or look for another
hmm.
job. But so there's lots of context for each one of these
Right.
things. But I think it's important for people to always know, don't ever lose sight of the fact that you have choices. Like, because when you don't think you have a choice, that can feel like, your back's against a wall, you're trapped. It's the feeling of being trapped is horrible. I mean,
Hmm.
again, that's bondage. And yet you always have choices. You might not like your choices. You might not like them, but you do have choices. And again, you want to take responsibility and, move towards those choices.
Yeah.
But I would expect pushback.
Right. And I think that's the two things I'm kind of extrapolating from what you're saying. I think is the first thing is for the person who's going through these tools and starting to implement them is to expect the pushback in interpersonal relationships. To
Yes.
say that's important. And then secondly, I know for me in times where I've had trouble either holding my boundaries or expressing them, often it's coming from a place of fear of
Yes.
many things, rejection, approval. And then again, I have to look at myself and go, that goes back to me. These are things I need to work on.
Right.
The fact that I'm seeking that from another person, and that's
Yes.
causing me to be afraid instead of knowing that I am approved. I am not rejected by the Lord.
Yes. People need to keep in mind too, every time, if you're expressing a healthy boundary, you are loving your neighbor as yourself.
Mm,
You're modeling, um, you're modeling healthy spirituality. And that's what we want to be, quote unquote, that's what we want to be giving away. And so it might not always be easy for the person in front of me, but actually it will be down the road, because every time I am set free and I'm living out of my integrity and I'm expressing healthy boundaries, I'm going to set somebody else free. I am going to.
mm,
through living out of my integrity, I'm going to set someone else free. Even if in the short term, I'm disappointing them or making them mad or whatever. There's a lot bundled in expressing a healthy boundary.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so good. I love how you tied that together, that you're actually loving the other person. The freedom. I love that this.
Absolutely.
So we're running out of time, but just finally, these tools, we like to end our podcast, with a practical application, and really these tools that we've just discussed are the practical application. Are there any final tips just regarding assessing how a person, needs to implement these, in the best way to be able to practice them? Do you have any kind of final tips for our listeners?
I would refer people again to the Emotionally Healthy Relationship course, because those skills begin to help us use the tools that are in the toolkit. Using our voice, right? Self-declaration, the ladder in particularly, the ladder of integrity is all about taking responsibility and not blaming.
Right.
It's all about taking responsibility for my choices, my values, and not blaming. And so it's a really beautiful tool to get at this. And again, I will say it's a huge, beautiful spiritual and emotional developmental task, a human developmental task, when we cross over the line from not blaming and taking responsibility for our own lives.
Yes. So good. So good. Well, Geri, thank you so much for this conversation today. And I just want to remind our listeners again, these tools that we talked about are just a few of the many in this chapter in the Emotionally Healthy Woman book and workbook. And so we hope you'll pick it up and read through the rest of them. So valuable, as you just said, in our personal development.
Yeah, and let me just distinguish between, so the Emotionally Healthy Woman book, along with the workbook, because the workbook really helps you to walk this out practically. There are a lot of practical tools with the workbook and the book. Now, different from that is what we call the Emotionally Healthy Relationships course.
Right.
And that actually is a whole course on learning skills for loving our neighbor well. So, you and I keep talking about tools, and we have tools coming out of the EH Woman. We got tools coming out of the EH Relationship course. So,
yeah, it's the whole package. You guys have got the whole package going on. I just call it the Emotionally Healthy Discipleship program at my church, because that's, there's so many wonderful components of it. And as you just mentioned, the Emotional Healthy Relationships course is invaluable. So good. Yeah. Wonderful for people's development and how they relate to others. But all right, we are out of time. Thank you so much again. And we hope we will see you. We won't see you, but you'll tune in next time for our next podcast. Have a wonderful day. Thank you, Geri.
Thank you.